On my 10th birthday, I was diagnosed with tarsal coalition. It was not a very good birthday. This is a condition that affects the ankle, both of my ankles, essentially meaning that I had an extra piece of cartilage in there. And if it was allowed to develop throughout my adolescence, it would eventually fuse the joint in my ankle and render me unable to walk. I was lucky enough to have surgery to correct the issue. The cartilage was removed, and after some time in a wheelchair, I learned to walk again. These days, I can get around perfectly well, though it still might look a little weird and be a bit painful at times. However, the procedure that granted me my movement wasn't invented until sometime in the 1970s. Had I been born before then, my life likely would have been very different. As someone who loves history and fantasy so much, I can't help but think of how much less I'd be able to do if I lived in a different time or a different place and didn't have the resources afforded to me. I've been very lucky. That's why Larys Strong always stood out to me, pun intended. Today, I'm going to analyze his character in all its highs and lows. I think he's a fascinating individual who says a lot about the systems at play in Westeros. I think House of the Dragon has done a great job with his character, save for one scene, which I'll discuss. I'm Quinn the GM, and thank you for joining me in this dive on Larys the Gloveput and how George R.R. Martin writes disability. My favorite scene in the most recent episode of House of the Dragon, Season 2, Episode 6, for those watching this in the future, is the conversation between the injured Aegon II and Larys, who came to visit the king while he's abed. Larys tells the story of his birth, that his leg was so twisted when he was pulled from his mother, that his father, Lord Lionel Strong, blamed a witch for cursing him and his child. When we met Lord Lionel last season, we never saw his wife. This story of a complication with Larys' birth does make me think we might need to add Mrs. Strong to the long list of characters that have died in this story during childbirth, which, between the main series and House of the Dragon, is extensive. Larys' counsel to Aegon during this scene is, for my money, the most important advice the young king has heard all season. We heard Tyrion say something similar during the first season of Game of Thrones: to know who you are and wear it like armor. Know yourself, know your strengths, know your limits, and play them to your advantage. Larys takes that further, discussing the many ways in which an individual is perceived. Those around you will make assumptions based on what they see. Worst of all, they'll pity you. It's up to you to turn that assumption against them. This society in Westeros is inherently biased against Larys, and now the council is biased against the infirmed Aegon. But Larys views this as a way to seize further power and opportunity that might not otherwise be afforded to either of them. In the book, Littlefinger isn't dissimilar to this. He's just an amiable guy from a lesser family. Everybody underestimates him due to his station, rather than his physicality, and he plays that to his advantage. Classism and ableism both play roles in Westeros, and we get to see those roles manifest through these characters. We see Larys do something similar as a part of his first appearance way back in Season 1. He can't partake in the hunt for Aegon's name day, so he sits with the ladies. He doesn't contribute to the conversation, save for introducing himself, but he sits back and just absorbs information that may someday be useful in his pursuits. While on the topic of his early appearances, I'd like to discuss a pair of relationships that never saw much screen time, but that I find fascinating. Larys' relationships with his brother Harwin and his father Lionel. Starting with the latter, we have exactly one comment from Larys about his father. Specifically, during the first season, he comments to Alicent that his father's honor has always been a millstone about his esteemed neck. His relationship with Harwin is harder to gauge outside of one comment about the Hightower beacon, but it can't have been great given that Larys does kill both his brother and his father. Harwin Strong, also called Breakbones, was known to be the strongest man in Westeros in his time. I think that Larys saw and resented that society defined his family members by their positive traits, their honor, their strength, while he himself was only ever known as the clubfoot. Both of his family's traits are also traditionally perceived as masculine and good, while in Westerosi society, Larys' condition forces him to sit with ladies and be excluded from any hunt or greater pursuits. Brief sidebar, this video is meant to discuss exclusively physical disabilities. Martin also does a fantastic job writing a plethora of characters with mental conditions of all magnitudes, and that would be a topic of an entirely different video if you'll want to see it. I'd love to make it if people enjoy this one. If you'd like to see it, let me know in the comments, and while you're down there, leave a like, subscribe if you'd want to see it, and make sure you don't miss it someday. Adding on to this, Larys isn't a very good guy. I know this is groundbreaking reporting. I felt like I had a duty to tell you. I'm sorry that you had to find out this way, but I do like how it factors into his character. I like that he's not framed as evil because of his disability, as that tends to happen in older stories and in the historical record. Richard III of England is a good example of this. He had scoliosis, as was discovered a few years ago when his remains were uncovered in a parking lot, and his enemies framed him as an evil hunchback. It was an image painted by them that lingered in the historical record, but in reality, both his condition and his actions were much more complicated and nuanced than they were given credit. Tropes and characters in culture and myth tend to focus on physical disability specifically as a unique sort of moral failing, but often do so simply for their own sake. These customs and tales are often rooted in a lack of understanding of an individual's condition and assumptions about the world and the way it works. In history, disabilities were often seen as some sort of divine wrath. It's hard to believe that any deity would allow bad things to happen to good people, for all of these people back in the old days with more limited ideas about the world and its scope. Because of this, the disabilities of historical figures were typically handled one of two ways. Physical disability was often used as propaganda by the rivals of a disabled individual. I started this section by discussing Richard III, and he's a perfect example of this. His disability is primarily emphasized after his death, not during his lifetime, by the Tudors, a rival monarchical family aiming to decrease his legitimacy. The other option for disabled figures in history is to attempt to hide their condition. Kaiser Wilhelm II is the most famous example of this via his twisted arm. Figures have their disabilities exaggerated if they're viewed as villains, but diminished if they're portrayed as heroes, and that tends to be reflected in fictional stories as well as just overall the course of history. George R. R. Martin breaks away from this trend. His character's moral alignment is fully separated from their physical station. Yes, their physicality and how it shapes their life certainly influence their motivations and their choices, but no character is simply evil or good due to being afflicted by or lacking a disability. All characters are simply people with human hearts in conflict with themselves. Larys is far from the only character in A Song of Ice and Fire with a disability. In fact, Martin tends to write about individuals facing some sort of limitation or another, and oftentimes those limitations are expressed physically. Tyrion, Bran, and Jaime are probably his best and most iconic examples of doing so in the main series. In all three cases, their conditions act as a component of their characters, not as a summation of their characters. I feel like a lot of high fantasy has a tendency to ignore that many real people struggle with physical limitations in their daily life, and they usually don't incorporate that into a story. I'm not saying that's inherently bad. Some stories are simpler and don't necessarily need to include disability, but I do think that Martin's stories are so much better for his exploration of disability and the role it plays in any person's life. With all of that said, I've had exactly one issue with how Larys's disability is portrayed in House of the Dragon, so this criticism doesn't apply to Martin, but rather to the show, and it unsurprisingly comes from Season 1, Episode 9, The Green Council. Larys being sexually fixated on Alicent's feet really just didn't land for me. It feels fairly reductive, having the one significantly physically disabled character on the show, outside of Aemond, who could still function pretty much as the average person, but now cycloptically, and Viserys, who can't do much of anything by the end, have a fetish centering around that disability. It'd be like if Jaime suddenly started being attracted to hands after his was cut off, Kaiser Wilhelm II moment. I don't think this breaks Larys or breaks the show, but overall I just really wasn't a fan of it or just the scene in general. I like the message it's putting across that Larys likes to feel that he has power over those around him in contrast to the image that he presents, especially in light of him kind of resenting the pity that we saw in this past episode, but I really didn't like the execution. A lot of Season 1, Episode 9 centers around shock and awe, you know what scene I'm talking about, so this strikes me as a bit more of that rather than any consideration in the writing. Enough of my small criticisms, let's get back to the good stuff. I've referenced Richard III earlier on in the script, and I did so for a reason. In an interview, Tom Glynn-Carney, who plays Aegon, has described the king's injuries at Rook's Rest as having a transformational effect on him. He describes the character before as being comparable to Richard II, at least in Shakespeare, as being a foolish and inept king. Aegon is said to then transition into being Richard III, a quieter, more clever king, though limited by his physicality. This really encapsulates how Martin tends to use disabilities as inflicted by injuries, not as the end for a character, but as a massive shift in status quo. It galvanizes transformation and results in an individual changing. That change is often for the better and worse simultaneously. Jaime becomes a better person but loses his martial skill. Bran unlocks psychic gifts at the cost of his dreams of being a knight. Seeing Aegon seemingly begin along the same path gives me great hope for his future in the show, and I am excited to see it. Enough about Aegon. Let's talk about the main inspiration for this video a bit more, Larys Strong. The instances I just described revolve around individuals gaining a disability later on in their lives, while figures such as Larys or Tyrion are defined by the way they were born. Both characters express very similar views on their conditions, that being as an inevitable part of their lives. Yes, both characters would be happier without their condition, but dwelling on what might have been is pointless. They choose to play the hand they're dealt, and in both cases gain substantial power and influences for it. These characters do not fail because of their disabilities, nor do they succeed because of them. They simply act, and when acting, they consider the fullness of their being and of their capabilities. They are not lesser or greater than any other individual. They are people, they are human. That is what drew me into Martin's writing 8 years ago. His world is alive and populated by people defined by distinct strengths, flaws, bonds, and potential. These characters grow organically as he writes them, and oftentimes have some sort of limitation on their growth, and that limitation only leads to greater potential in the long run. Jaime's physical disability leads to the Kingslayer losing his purpose in life, only to be renewed as an individual focused on honor, duty, and doing what he can to protect those around him. It's that arc that initially got me into A Song of Ice and Fire. George R. R. Martin is my favorite author, and it's thanks in large part to how he writes disabled characters. Thank you all for watching. This was a bit more personal and in-depth than a lot of my other videos. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, I'd really appreciate it if you liked the video, subscribed, left comments, all that typical stuff that helps the channel and just generally is free and makes me feel good. I'll have more stuff out in the near future, talking about A Song of Ice and Fire, House of the Dragon, Game of Thrones, everything in Westeros and revolving around George R. R. Martin. I thank you very much for joining me today, and I will see you soon. Goodbye, everyone.